Hey, this is Shannon with Stack of Stones, and today we're going to talk a little bit about grief and loss, which is not an exciting topic, but it's a really important topic because if you're a human being, grief and loss is a part of your life. And we're not always great about identifying it or knowing how to talk about it. It's the kind of thing that as Americans, it's not really a big piece of our culture. We tend to prefer to focus on like independence, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, succeed, not grief. And then additionally, if you're a guardian, it's even worse. So here at Stack of Stones, we use the word guardian to kind of pull together everybody that works in a helping role. So this is everyone from first responders to social services to healthcare. If your job is to help people who are suffering in one way or another, then we wrap you into this bucket of guardian. And the reason we do that is your job is, first of all, super important. Thank you for the work that you do. And then second of all, it's really hard. Right? It can really mess with you. It has a huge impact on your mental health and your relational health. And so around here, we're all about taking really good care of you. So this video will be specific to guardian grief and loss. And just like we're not great at talking about it in general, if you're a guardian, there's a good chance that your organizational environment isn't great about talking about grief and loss or other hard emotions, okay? So we're all working to do better, but a lot of departments and agencies still have kind of that suck it up, tough it out undertone. And that doesn't result in a lot of open conversation around something like grief and loss. Okay, so today we're going to talk about it. This training will probably be like 20 to 30 minutes. I know that might feel a little long to talk about something like grief, but I really want to unpack several elements. And I really just invite you to take this time to think about how grief may be impacting you, because we need to take care of it. Grief doesn't just go away, right? Time doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes we need to really identify and process it in order to be healthy and well. If you're thinking, I don't really feel a lot of grief, I don't think grief is a part of my life, maybe there's a chance you don't feel a lot of grief. However, my guess would be that maybe you just don't know how to identify it. One thing you may be feeling is anger. So grief a lot of times will present as anger if we don't know how to handle the grief. So if you find yourself being increasingly angry, or maybe the people around you are saying you're increasingly angry, what I want you to consider is maybe grief is one of the reasons. It may be a lot of other stuff, right? I have lots of trainings on compassion fatigue and everything, but there's a good chance grief is a piece of the puzzle, okay? Alternately, one thing I really see with my clients is if they're feeling grief, it either comes out as anger or sometimes it just comes out as disconnection. So if you're feeling really shut down, really separate and isolated from the people around you, or again, if they're saying they think you're really shut down, there's a chance that grief is contributing to that separation. So if you're noticing either of those things in your life, take this time to consider grief. Take this time to consider whether there's some underlying stuff that would be worth working through. Okay, so let's define grief and loss. The way I generally define it is kind of like hitting your funny bone. So you walk through a doorway, you're not paying attention, you whack your funny bone. The impact, that hit, is the loss. So we lose something. The grief is the feeling, okay? So you hit your funny bone and that feeling goes through your entire arm. That's grief. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack a bunch of different types of losses, and just know that grief is the feeling that accompanies it. This grief can look like depressive symptoms, right? You're just really sad, really low energy, nothing interests you. You don't want to go out and do activities. You're not interested in eating. You can't sleep. Sometimes this can feel escalated. You may not be able to rest and relax. You're feeling really anxious. Grief can look like all kinds of different things. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what the grief piece is. I'm going to focus more on the losses because that will likely help you identify some of the underlying causes. Okay, so let's talk about different categories and types of loss. And if you're hearing a bunch of noise in the background, sorry, my dog's in here. I could kick him out, but I like having dogs around when I talk about topics like grief and loss. It's helpful for me, and it's probably helpful for you if he makes an appearance. Okay, so sorry about the noise. So different types of grief and loss. First of all, I'm going to talk about what I'm going to call straightforward losses. But the first thing I want to do is identify that just because a loss is straightforward doesn't mean it's not devastating, okay? Just because I call these simpler or more straightforward does not mean they are not absolutely devastating losses, okay? It just means the actual details of the loss are a bit less complex. So an example of a straightforward loss is your 95-year-old grandma has a stroke and dies. Okay, very sad. We're very sad to lose grandma, but it's pretty straightforward. She's elderly. She's had a long life. It's a natural cause of death. She passes away, right? Pretty cut and dry. Same thing if like maybe your spouse gets into a car accident and dies. Again, these are all devastating losses, but it's pretty cut and dry as far as the details go. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about complex losses. And complex losses are equally devastating, but they often come with a lot more confusion. The emotions are more complex and sometimes competing, which makes them challenging in a different way. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. These straightforward losses are devastating, but we know what to do with them a little bit more. So first of all, the emotional reaction tends to be more straightforward. Okay, we feel sadness, grandma dies, we feel sadness, we miss her, all these different things. It doesn't tend to be as confusing as some of the losses we'll talk about in a little bit. Again, still horrible, but more straightforward. And then alternately, the people around us know how to handle a straightforward loss better. Straightforward losses tend to have Hallmark cards for them, right? We have process and procedure. So if your husband dies in a car accident, it is awful, and we know how to do a service and a funeral. There's my dog. He says, please stop recording so I can go home. We know how to do a service, right? We know how to bring the casseroles. We know how to buy the cards and the flowers. There's process around it. The people in our lives know how to talk about it. They know how to be as supportive as possible. I mean, let's be honest. If you've ever had any significant losses, sometimes we're not great at knowing what to say, but it's better, okay? So that is straightforward loss. I'm going to run through really quick some of the different types of loss, right? Because loss of life is the one that probably comes to mind when you think about grief and loss. But there's all these different other areas of life where we can experience loss and therefore grief. And we may not recognize it as loss, which means that we may not validate and take care of ourselves in the way that we need, okay? So loss of life is important. I also want to make sure that we honor and validate loss of life of pets. Okay, so if you lose your pet, it's absolutely devastating. It can be a really, really disruptive thing to our lives and our schedules. They leave a pretty big hole. Okay, so let's honor that. I seriously don't know what he's doing, but I've re-recorded this several times because the sound was all messed up, so he's just going to have to work it out, you know? We can also lose relationships, okay? So a primary form of this would be something like a divorce or a breakup. This can also be something like our friends move away or we move away from our friends. That's a loss of relationship. Some of this is by choice. We want to distance ourselves from somebody who feels unhelpful to our lives. Okay, those are really painful losses. I will point out when I say all human beings experience some sort of loss and grief, I'm recording this January 2022, which means we're still in the middle of COVID. And it's had a pretty major impact on us relationally, right? So for a while, this was quarantine and you couldn't see people. And it's also had some weird relational stuff as we get into all these battles about vaccines and masks and stuff. There's loss and there's grief in the midst of that. So just know that if you're feeling, it's because there's loss, okay? One thing we can lose, and this is going to sound fluffy, but this idea of hopes and plans, right? When we have a plan for our lives, let's use the example of divorce. So not only do you lose that relationship, right, the present day loss of that relationship, you're also losing some of the stuff you hoped for in the future. Maybe you hope to have a family, you hope to have grandkids, you hope to travel when you're retired. There's the loss of the relationship, but we also need to honor and validate the loss of those hopes and plans. Some of this may be you get to retirement age and your life doesn't look the way you hoped it would, right? Maybe you thought by a certain age you would be at a certain life stage, right? By this age I would be married, or by this age I'd have kids. There can be some loss in those plans, okay? And we don't want to, I don't want to say that if you're 30 and unmarried, you're over the hill or whatever. That's not true. So we don't want to too much allow that to be true, but make some space and let yourself feel the sadness. It's okay. That's okay. Okay. Another thing we can lose is property and belongings, right? So if you work in fire, this is something you may see more regularly, right? So if somebody's house burns down, that is a significant loss. Likewise, if you lose like a wedding ring or you break your grandma's china or something like that, obviously it's not the same as if somebody dies, but it's okay. If you feel a sense of loss, it's okay. Name it, allow it to be real. If we just ignore it and try to shame ourselves into not feeling sad, that's not effective. It's not going to work. Function and capabilities, right? So if you get into an accident, you become paralyzed, you lose function. Just simple aging, right? I've hit 40. I don't recover from a night out the way I used to. It's not like I'm actively grieving that, but there is a loss of function. The more extreme the loss of function, the higher the level of grief. So with something like paralysis or maybe loss of cognitive function, if we have someone working through dementia or Alzheimer's, right? This is a significant source of loss and a significant source of grief. And then finally, position and mission. This can be a really big one within guardian roles. So your job is a very mission-focused role. You are serving your community. You are protecting, you are healing, whatever it is that you're doing. If you lose this in some way, it is a significant source of grief. So there's a couple places where I pay very close attention to this. One is if somebody goes on light duty, right? That can be light duty because of an injury can be a really big deal. So I'm always making sure I'm paying attention to clients who have that shift. And then same thing with retirement. Retirement is actually a pretty dangerous time for an increase in suicidal ideation because there's various factors, but one of them is you lose this sense of mission and focus. It's okay. If you have gone through a transition where you've lost that, it's okay that you feel upset and sad. And I'm actually going to use this one to transition to complex grief. Okay, so we talked about straightforward grief, and I talked a little bit about complex grief. So let's kind of dive into that one and explain why it can be so difficult to deal with. Like I said before, the issue with complicated grief is it often has competing emotions. So let's use retirement. You work your whole life to retire, right? So let's say you hit your 30 years, you've got your pension, you get your watch or medal or whatever the heck they give you. You're super excited. So you've got all these positive emotions. You feel really free. You can do whatever you want with your time. You can travel, you can golf, blah, 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 blah. And there's these underlying losses. And if we don't know how to address and balance those, it can really mess with us, right? So if you lose that sense of purpose and mission when you get up in the morning, if you lose the structure of a workday, you lose the relationships with your coworkers, all of those feel sad. There's grief. There can be some anxiety when we lose structure. And I hear on a fairly regular basis that those losses are super discombobulating. But it's confusing because you're supposed to be happy. And so you don't know what to do with it. You feel potentially ashamed of the sadness. You ignore it, you isolate, you pretend it's not there. And this is where we get into dangerous territory. Okay? So a loss is more complex if it has competing emotions. And then it also gets more complex when the people around us don't know how to address it. One of the primary examples of a complicated loss is suicide, right? So the death is in and of itself really sad, but then you add that this person took their own life. That adds all kinds of competing emotions, right? So you've got the sadness. There's a lot of times a sense of guilt, right? So some people feel really guilty that they didn't intervene earlier. There can be anger, right? Really, really angry that someone made that choice. There could be relief. So if the person that completed suicide was hard, maybe they were a really kind of chaotic, difficult relationship, you might feel a little bit relieved that you're off that roller coaster, but then you feel bad because you feel relieved, right? So anytime these emotions are swirling, that makes it a more complicated loss. Suicide also, I want you to think in terms of those structures and rituals. Take, for example, the eulogy, right? So you want to write a eulogy to honor this person, and there's the giant elephant in the room that they completed suicide, right? That's hard. Likewise, if we take a loss like your spouse dies in a car accident, what if they were driving drunk? Okay, all of a sudden that becomes a much more complicated loss because you're sad and you're angry, right? And what if in the middle of that drunk driving accident they hurt other people, right? So there's all these other complicated pieces. And anytime it gets harder to interpret your internal response and harder for the people around you to know how to respond, I want you to pay attention to that complexity because it tends to result in increasing shame, right? So if we're confused about our emotions, we can get really ashamed of that. Shame tends to result in silence. So then you're not talking about what you're experiencing. And that silence tends to result in isolation. And all those are bad things. Bad, bad, bad. Okay. Likewise, if the people around us don't know how to address or support or handle it, that increases the isolation. That's not good. There may be a sense of embarrassment in whatever the loss was, right? It might be something that is socially challenging. Okay. The reason we're paying attention to these complex losses is we're increasing that isolation. Whether it's straightforward or complicated, these are losses that we all encounter as human beings. Unfortunately, being a human being means encountering loss. It's just a part of the package we get here. These second two are more specific to guardian roles. Okay, so if you're a human being, you get the first two losses. If you're a guardian, you get bonus areas of loss, which is why I think it's so important that we're consistently talking about grief and loss and providing you avenues of support. So one of the areas that you get bonus loss is this idea of secondary or vicarious loss. So you may have heard of secondary or vicarious trauma, right? And that's the idea that if you witness a trauma or you read about a trauma in a case report, you feel the impact of that trauma yourself. Okay, that's another training. I have one of those on my website. And this one, what I want to talk about is the idea of vicarious grief. So if you sit by a campfire, you smell like smoke. That just is the way it works, right? The smoke is absorbed into your clothing and your hair, and you smell like campfire smoke. If you are around people who are experiencing grief and loss, you absorb it in much the same way. You can pretend you don't, or you can try to keep your distance from it, but as human beings, part of how we're made is that we're connected and we mirror each other. This vicarious grief can be pretty significant, partially because it's very sneaky. You may not realize that you're carrying home that grief. You may not have words for it. You may not recognize it. But think about it. If day after day you're seeing really sad stuff, it's going to pile up. So going back to if you're finding yourself increasingly angry or increasingly disconnected, this vicarious grief is likely a part of it. Okay. And then the final one is this idea of, I don't have a great phrase for it, but you're a participant in the grief. So this could be something like you work in healthcare or as a first responder and you don't save the patient, right? So you're performing CPR and it's not working and the family is sitting there watching you and you're watching them freak out, right? You're watching them grieve. You're not doing anything wrong. This isn't your fault. You're doing your job, but you're a part of it, and that can feel really hard. Or if you have to be the one that gives the bad news that somebody didn't survive, or if you have to make the arrest, if you have to arrest the parents and you know the kiddos are going to end up in foster care, or you're the social worker that has to do the removal. All these things, you are doing your job, you're doing a good thing, and it feels horrible because it's resulting in grief. This is where it gets, again, anytime those emotions are conflicting, right? You know you're doing your job and it feels like shit. That can get really confusing and therefore really shameful. So I want you paying attention to these and taking steps to take care of yourself. Okay? Okay, so what we just did is we went through all the different kind of categories and types just to get you thinking about things that may be a loss that you hadn't considered. One of my foundational beliefs is that we can't be healthy and well if we don't know how to assess and adapt, right? So that first part of the training was to help you kind of assess, what have I been through? What have I experienced? Does it count as grief and loss? And should I take care of it? This next piece is going to be that respond or adapt piece. I'm going to tell you a couple of general things you can do to take care of yourself. However, I want to make it really clear that we're all unique. I just went through all kinds of different ways we can experience grief. And I can't give you a one-size-fits-all way to deal with it, okay? If you are experiencing high levels of grief, if I was going through all those different things and you were like, oh no, I've experienced a ton of those, it's okay to ask for help. If you are a guardian, you are on the front lines of grief, right? That campfire smoke is all throughout you. It's okay to get help. So I always talk about how a football player has a lot of physical supports, right? So if you play professional football, your body's getting banged up on a consistent basis. Therefore, you have physical therapists, massage therapists, chiropractors, ice baths, right? You have all these different things to support you because of the needs of your profession. If you are a guardian, you are getting mentally and emotionally beat up on a consistent basis, and therefore your relationships are getting beat up. It's okay to need support. I believe that guardians should have mental health support from the very beginning of your career on a regular basis, right? Not every week, but you should have someone you can check in with. If you need some type of support because you've experienced a lot of grief, that doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you a failure. It just means that your job bangs you up a little bit. Okay? So with that being said, here's a couple of different things to consider as you work through grief. One, grief is not linear. So if you've ever heard that 5 stages of grief thing, the lady who actually did that research later came back and was like, no, this does not apply. Do not use this. She developed that research in response to people who had received a diagnosis of a terminal illness. So the 5 stages was very specific to coming to terms with a terminal illness. It does not apply to grief in general. Okay, grief is nonlinear. It is circular. It is up and down. It'll take us by surprise. We'll have good days. We'll have bad days, and that's normal. It sucks. I wish it was linear, right? Then we could just have a plan, work through it, right? High five and move on our way. That's not how it works, though. Okay, so grief is going to come and go. Sometimes we don't know why it comes and goes. Other times we know that it is pretty impacted by things like traditions or sensory experiences, right? We just went through the holidays. Holidays can be a really tough time for grief because kind of the traditions and the rituals and the sounds and the smells remind us of something that we've lost. A lot of times there may be a specific food or a specific scent that brings you right back to a type of loss. That's not going to be linear, right? That's not just going to go away. Our bodies are pretty complicated, and that sensory piece that brings us back to memory is really powerful. Okay, so don't get mad at yourself if it's not following a linear process. Which brings me to my next point, which is self-compassion. The only way we're going to really deal with grief is if we're kind to ourselves. I want you to think about your internal narrative, especially around maybe some of these losses that are more professional. Are you saying things to yourself like, you should be over this? Why can't you just get over it? It's not that big of a deal. Why are you so upset? Come on, don't be a baby. Suck it up. Get over it. Like if that's your internal narrative about any of the things I identified as losses, it's not helpful. That narrative is not going to get you over it. I don't think you can just magically stop. None of us can just magically stop our internal narrative, but it is something that we want to work on adjusting. That's the kind of thing I do a lot of work on with clients in here, is adjusting the way we're mean as hell to ourselves, right? We beat ourselves up all day long. It is not helpful. Instead, try to replace it with like, okay, compassionate, right? How would you be compassionate to somebody else? This may not seem like a big deal, but it's having an impact on me, so it must be important to me in some way, right? Be kind to yourself. One of the ways you're kind to yourself is you carve out some time. It's not like you like put on your calendar, cry for 30 minutes. It's not necessarily like that, but you give yourself some space, right? If you finish this training, don't just go start running errands. Maybe let yourself sit and feel the feels for a little bit. Again, we can't just pretend it's not there. We can't just stay busy and ignore it and our feelings just magically disappear. That doesn't work. It's going to come out as that rage or that disconnection, okay? Carve out time and then potentially think about building some process and ritual in. So for those straightforward losses, right? Grandma dies, there's going to be a funeral, there's going to be the whatever it's called afterwards where you eat cookies, which I think is just kind of strange, right? There's the time where we sit around and eat small sandwiches, right? There's ritual and process. There's things that you do. For these more complex or professional losses, it's okay to give yourself a little ritual and process. For grandma, you may go to the cemetery once a year on her birthday and put roses on her headstone, right? That would be some ritual, some memory of her. You may need to do something similar for the other losses. And that may just be like on a certain day of the year, you go sit on a bench and drink a coffee in honor of the dog that you lost or something like that. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it does allow you to honor and validate the loss. If we go back to the idea of being kind to yourself, what we need to do is validate that this sucks, this hurts, this is grief, and that's going to help you actually work through it. I hope this was helpful. Grief is tricky because I can't give you something easy peasy to make it better, but I hope that you know that if you're suffering, if you're feeling it, it is very real. If you need help, please reach out. If you want to work through some grief with me, please don't hesitate to reach out. All my contact stuff is on my website. And I really, really, really appreciate the work that you do. And thanks for taking the hits that it tends to take. Okay. Thanks. Bye.